So we're going to do our recap of everything that's happened this week and talk a little bit about where we're going to go maybe next week for AMC and Ape. So there's a couple big glaring things that need to be mentioned first. So the first is that when we made this drop yesterday, we completed the head and shoulder target and the widening target. So the head and shoulder, you can see it pretty clearly here. Started February 14th. All the left side goes up to the 28th. That's a 14-day period, and then it came down. That target was that I found was 471. Hit that target, came much lower, made a double bottom. The widening target was really only down to 492. That has to do with this widening that was occurring on the way up. We got a narrowing on the way down and then broke down. We failed to cross any of the major creeks after the 13th. So like we came down above, this was the last major creek that we jumped over right here. And this price resistance, by the way, does go all the way back to August. It's this blue line you see on the chart. If you were to mark August through the December 8th top, you would see that we had actually leapt over that creek. But in recent days, we came back, right? So we came back down beneath it because of the head and shoulder, in part also because this is setting up very distributive like this series of up thrusts. And there's a massive widening channel here, but ultimately the reason that's important, and the reason that this being distribution, this being a head and shoulders and a widening breakdown, there's a lot of reasons for it. The main being that it would essentially have been a bull trap in this area if it was distribution, and it proved to be, a bull trap. So when it gets to this point, you're looking at that breakdown, and all those targets were saying, hey, if you break down that low, you're now beneath that uptrend. You're now beneath that creek. And both of those came to fruition in recent days. So during the meeting yesterday, when they announced that, it's going to definitely have this conversion, we saw that AMC tanked and Ape did a little bit of a rocket up to 2, and then it ended up selling off pretty hard back down to 165, where it's just kind of chilling out at the moment. That was expected. You do have Antara, which is something I mentioned in the stream today. You have them with their lockup period being done, so they're allowed to do whatever they want with their shares now, and they have lots of shares, like millions and millions of shares that they're going to be able to sell if they want into the market. So I think the expectation here that we have of possibly a short squeeze, possibly retail kind of footing the bill for that, and then maybe starting that kind of reactive move would be in the best interest of Antara so that they could sell higher. But in my opinion, I do agree that they're probably going to distribute. So I don't think they're going to hold those shares into conversion at this point. I think they might hold some of them, but I think they're going to want to get their payday at a high rate. So if they dumped all their shares into the market all at once, this thing would tank like really low. So they're going to be smart about it, and the smartest way to do that would probably be to sort of try to instigate some kind of a turnaround here and some kind of a short squeeze so that they could sell higher. I can't guarantee they're going to do that. It's all speculation on my part because really it depends a lot on supply and demand, and it depends on how shorts respond, right? And if Antara really did dump all their shares all at once, this would be a very crazy situation, right? So for the time being, I think we still have support down here at $1.44 area. We might go a little bit lower than that. If we break beneath that $1.44, you're looking at $1.28. That region would be a major support. And if it didn't hold, then I don't see why you wouldn't necessarily come all the way back down to like even below 65 cents. I'm not being like fear mongering. I'm saying that that's possible, and if not probable, if you break down here. You're losing a lot of supports here in this area. So any kind of a short squeeze situation would probably lead you to relative highs. You're talking about coming up to that 340 area, which makes some sense. You're talking about 258 perhaps first. And then, of course, the resistance that we created yesterday seems like it's also a possible big deal, which is at 210. And right now, it looks like it it could be setting up a bit of a head and shoulder, which would mean more downside. So I don't really think it's wise at this point to chase ape. I think if you want to get a bargain on it, you kind of use your head and just trade it smartly, right? Like maybe you can enter some now, but I would I would say that there's probably between now and possibly April 27th going to be a lot of arbitrage going on. So for that matter, we know that Adam Aaron released he released it to the press that he was going to he put a excuse me, he wanted to end the lawsuit, so he wants to kind of like nip it in the bud now that they've got the vote in. If that happens, there's no real telling how quickly that could happen, and it could be very soon. It could be that they don't actually need to do the 27th and all that court junk. What that would mean is like, oh, well, suddenly it's dismissed. So the movement to dismiss would be immediate, perhaps, if it happened. And so it could be randomly in the middle here, in a couple weeks that we end up seeing, oh, yeah, now we're going to just convert. You know what I mean? We don't know. So that's kind of an unknown variable there. For AMC, I'm really just looking at it like a basic stock still. I still think that the breakdown here was very evident. Using this in combination with what we used in the deviation chart, which helped determine, this is probably going to have a slide for AMC and a bump for APE, and a change in deviation. And then specifically, and the one that I think has been really, really useful is the combo chart, which has the combination prices, kind of how they're moving together and the correct formula. And you can see this has been highly consistent, like very reliable. These head and shoulders broke down very symmetrically in a lot of ways, and then each of these targets has been hit pretty well. So we were expecting that 265 to 271 bounce, and I think it bounced at like 270. You know what I mean? It filled its gaps here. There's another gap down below. This was the larger head and shoulder target. It was an exact 87 cents from the breakdown on the neckline to come all the way back down to the 235 price target. So that would be a 235 of this equation. So like the solution to this equation, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean the AMC is going to be 235 or APE's going to be, higher or lower. It just really would have to be a combination value that gives you the correct answer. And it could be a number of things. So the best thing we could do, though, is use this to help us determine like whether or not these moves have finished. And I think that might be really beneficial. So if you come down to this creek area, it bounces and finds support and then drops again. Well, now you're looking at either a double bottom or a spring. But that gives us an indication of time. And that's something that for AMC and APE can sometimes be very confusing. Like, how far along are you really? This gives a much clearer picture of like, oh yeah, there's the double M's, and now it's going to come down and decide where it's going to make its spring. And I think that whole concept may be lost on a lot of folks, because if we don't follow along for a while, especially lately, because I've not been the most popular talking about downside, it can be a little bit frustrating to think like, oh, great, here we go again. But it's not really like that. Like, it's not as bad as it sounds. This is, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, this is it. Like, this is that last drop that happens when you get to the end of a sequence, specifically like right here. When I'm looking at the master fractal, I don't think there's anything left. I believe that what we just did was essentially this whole right side. We did it as a final accumulation here. And yeah, it represents like the whole thing, but right, so because that's the way iterations work, is that you always have like the same thing repeating like indefinitely as you shrink down. And yeah, I do believe there's going to be like one more small accumulation down bottom that's like looks so similar to this with the kind of widening and shrinking that goes on, but that ultimately leads into the final spring in April. That has to do with that rotational symmetry chart, which finishes in mid-April, and has been very consistent. And so to me, when I'm seeing this right here, I'm just thinking in my brain, like, this is kind of it. Like, this should be the last major moves down are happening right now in the next week or so. I don't see it as, oh, it's going to break back up and have this crazy other thing happening over here and yada, yada, yada. Like, no. We're looking at shrinking iterative moves that should be finishing. And specifically, like, I've been using it to help me with price targeting on this chart, but also just to get a better sense of reality, because the chart right now looks like, hey, AMC's at 443, but if we were to combine and have no reverse split, we would be at 261. And a lot of folks still think that you just add them together, and that doesn't really make sense. And I was like that for a long time. I wasn't even really thinking about the fact that they have different market share, different share counts, so you have to do total value, right, divided by the total number of outstanding shares. And that being said, like, this is not a bad situation. So as it stands, we're basically about to finish like the rotation. It's really, really, really close. There's not anything else left to do. Mathematically speaking, right, on this rotation, you're basically finished. So the only thing left to do is kind of run towards this intersection down here. This would be your low spring. It's like the inverse of what happened in June. It really is. And timing-wise, it should be fairly similar because, again, this whole structure has been identical in terms of timing. So at this point, yeah, I got like this groovy looking graph, but the main reason I did this was because I'm looking for this intersection. And it is quite low. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This comes down to like $3.15. I think the 350 target is probably what we're looking at in terms of a consolidation, and that we're going to see some push-ups, right, to try to break out before we finally drop again. And if you look carefully, you can see that this is essentially just a carbon copy of this previous area. It's just a double M shape right here. And this is what my expectation is moving forward, because this is how you get to 276 or whatever it is going to be, which is very close to the 786 value. Now, what happens if you convert early? I don't know. I don't really have a way to know what would exactly happen in that situation. I don't think anybody does. I do think that maybe it accelerates this quite a bit. Maybe it doesn't do anything. This is kind of where I'm not sure if the rubber meets the road exactly this way, but I think that as you come closer towards the end here, just like in the beginning, this gap between these two charts is narrower. I think it's the same thing. I think you're going to see like a narrowing of the distance between these things. And that has to do, again, with the deviation and like how far away are they really from one another. It's like right now, combined, they're at 257. You know what I mean? Like, that's super low. Both stocks are dropping simultaneously at the moment. Therefore, the combination formula is also dropping at the moment, And then when you look at deviation is not really dropping that much. It looks pretty much the same. But it should be doing something similar to what we saw over here, where after it jumps over like the major trend, it's probably going to form a bit of a bottom here in this region. And ultimately, yeah, if they come together, this deviation is going to go to zero. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. I still think that the most likely thing is that we're going to see him come back to like that 186 deviation, which means that as we move forward, they could change again in their proportion to one another and get a little bit further apart, but it's kind of a toss-up between either coming together in price and value versus coming back to like where they started. And thus far, they've done a lot to seem to kind of suggest that they would have them come back together in value. So for the time being, right, I'm not bullish on AMC. For the time being, I'm pretty bearish on it. I think that there's going to be some reaction. I'm kind of surprised that we're dropping right this second, But I do think there's going to be some reactionary stuff. This is a very fast, kind of accelerated move here. But for example, go back to what we saw in leading into the FOMC back in December, right? there was a lot of noise in that region, and eventually we kind of finished out crossing here, and then we hooked. And there's a very similar setup right now. So I'm not convinced necessarily that this is going to gap fill right this second. I guess if it did, okay, we're going down, you know what I mean? But if not, then I think you're going to have like a pretty strong reaction back to the upside, because I can't imagine leaving this without testing it in more surety. And right now, what the suggestion would be is that perhaps that happens going into FOMC. I think if you got a creek cross on this outer creek, and you can kind of see why this works really well. If you get a creek cross on this outer creek, you might see a push up to go retest that 520 area. And then perhaps, you could see a major sell-off depending on the way the market goes. That takes you all the way back down. So that's the kind of general recap of everything that's happened and everything that I'm personally expecting. I don't see any other major targets at the moment other than that 350, 315 area, and then possibly back up to 520 for AMC. And for APE, I mean, like I said, it's pretty much if it breaks below certain supports, it's going to go down. If it breaks above, it's going to go up. I don't think there's a lot more you can do with that other than just observe the relationship between the two and pay attention to perhaps the deviation and the combination chart to help you determine whether or not certain moves are accomplishing certain tasks. So